Well, welcome everybody. My name is Dr. K, and today I'm going to be talking about Proof-of-Entropy-Minima, or PoEM, which is a new consensus mechanism for blockchains. So to understand PoEM, we first need to define contention and understand why contention happens in proof-of-work blockchains and what we could potentially do to mitigate contention. So block contention, what is the problem with proof of work, or POW, P-O-W? The problem is if I have these two blocks and I quickly find two blocks in temporal proximity, the network sees these two blocks and it doesn't necessarily have a preference for which block it should choose and it should continue to build on. And the reason that this happens is because when we look at something like Bitcoin, it has tens of thousands of nodes running around the world. And when a block is found, it takes some time for the Bitcoin block to propagate and have all of the other nodes in the network know about it. So during that propagation time, another miner could very well find a block which meets the difficulty requirement sort of in that same propagation time window. And when that happens, we get one of these choices. And this is kind of like a fork choice. Now, one of the things that Bitcoin does, though, is they assign the difficulties of the blocks, or the weight of the blocks, the weight of the difficulty of the threshold. And in doing that, anytime we get a fork in Bitcoin, there's no preference between one block or the other because they're both weighted equally because they both have identical difficulty thresholds because they both have the same common parent. So if we look at this case where we had these two blocks created in this close time proximity, both of them have a difficulty of 100 and they have a total difficulty of 300. And so the network has no preference between one block and the other. So what does the network have to do? The network has to basically just keep mining on whichever block they saw first. But depending on which node you are and how close you were to the point at which one or the other block was generated, you will have received one of these blocks first. You don't actually know which one was generated first. All you know is which one was received first. So the rule sort of in Bitcoin is that you're just going to keep mining on the one that you saw first and hope that you're on sort of the right side of this contention. So this network delay that we have that's intrinsic to any distributed system leads to this fork choice. And eventually what happens is one of the two choices will get a block built upon it, and that will cause the alternate choice, in this case the top, to be orphaned or uncled. So anyway, what happens is we get this orphan or the uncle. But the more important piece here is that this block took time to resolve. And if we look at Bitcoin, the resolution of this contention takes place on average one block's time later. So say 10 minutes later. If we look at Ethereum, right, this will get resolved roughly on average in the next 10 seconds, but still on average it will take one more block time to have the network decide sort of which one of these heads is going to become canonical. And any work that's done on top of the one that's eventually orphaned is going to be wasted for the duration of that time interval. So the upshot here is mining creates blocks with equal weights, which creates contention. So the fact that these blocks were equally weighted and the network didn't have preference for either one is what causes this fork, and it is what causes this time interval to resolve this fork. So that is okay when you have a single chain running at low block rates. But this time and this contention becomes untenable when you're trying to coordinate an arbitrary number of chains in a scalable system like Quai Network. So is there a solution that will allow us to resolve forks faster? And that's where we bring in intrinsic block weight. So with current proof of work, blocks are assigned a threshold weight, meaning for simplifying purposes, when we find a Bitcoin block, effectively there's a controller that's determining how many zeros you need to find in the hash at the front of the hash to determine if you've met the difficulty threshold for creating a block. And in Bitcoin, when you find, say, these 4 zeros, for example, if you find any extra zeros, that Bitcoin block is still only assigned the weight of having found 4 zeros. So the intrinsic difficulty, which would be counting all of the zeros in the hash, is coerced down to the threshold weight. And that's why every fork block is identical. So what would happen if we tried to do proof of work, but rather use the intrinsic difficulty? So we'll count all zeros. What ends up happening if we take the same example where we have 2 blocks that are found roughly at the same time, the block weights now are different. So if we look at the top block, its intrinsic weight is 102, and the bottom block's intrinsic weight is 107. So immediately in the blockchain, even though these 2 blocks were created near simultaneously, the one that has the higher difficulty, the 107, is going to have a higher total difficulty, 312, and it's going to be preferenced by the chain. And the reason for this is if we use intrinsic measurements, blocks are never equal. So there will always be a preference anytime that there's contention. So this seems like a great idea because we can take this network delay that was creating forks and we can turn it into a network delay that just creates an orphan. But more importantly, we can completely eliminate the time to resolution of contention. So measuring intrinsic weight provides instantaneous preference. So this seems like a great thing. So when we get contention, we get 2 blocks produced roughly simultaneously, we can immediately decide as a network, as the tens of thousands of nodes that exist, what all the nodes want to do at the same time with the same decision. However, there's a problem. And the problem is we've now opened ourselves up to a withholding attack. So using intrinsic weight opens proof of work chain to a high duration withholding attack. So with current proof of work as it's set up without intrinsic block weights, our time to resolution is 1 additional block after the fork. However, if we introduce intrinsic proof of work, the time to resolution is 0 blocks. However, if an attacker decides to withhold one of the blocks because they found a block that has, they're very lucky, and they find a large number of zeros past the difficulty threshold, which will happen. So in this case, we found 5 extra zeros. That block weight as an intrinsic value would be worth 1 million compared to the one that's just at the threshold of 100. So what that means is that attacker can withhold that block. They've mined it, but they haven't shared it with anybody. And this network delay now is no longer a fork. It's now no longer an orphan, but an attacker can use it to create a deep reorg. So what they can do is they'll hold on to this block. They won't reveal it to other nodes in the network. They'll let the rest of the network keep happily mining on top of this alternate fork. And then eventually what they'll do is they'll reveal it. And when they reveal it, it will orphan out any work that has happened in the alternate branch when they reveal it. So, and the duration that they could do that for, in this particular example, is up to 10,000 blocks. So, although using intrinsic weight solves this problem of having all blocks and all forks be seemingly identical, and having to have delays to resolve which one the network prefers, when we just introduce intrinsic weight, we create a dramatic withholding attack. So this in and of itself is not tenable because we've removed all finite time finalization guarantees from proof of work by introducing intrinsic weight. Did you follow that one, Brenny?
Kind of. I think I'll start to get it as we go on.
Okay, we'll keep going here. So then the next question is, what do we need to change to be able to use intrinsics and still maintain finite finalization time? And the answer is we can measure the likelihood of an event. So in current proof of work, the difficulty of the K block is physically meaningless. And the way that we compute total difficulty is by linearly adding our previous total difficulty with the difficulty found in the current block to create our new total difficulty. However, what if we modify this property to be physically relevant and we define it as intrinsic entropy rather than difficulty? If we look at n and we define n as the number of bits of entropy removed from the system with the creation of a new block, where its mathematical definition would be L, the size of the field, minus the binary log of the hash that was found, we can use n to represent the reduction in entropy in the system when that block was found. So we've reduced the number of possible choices and paths that the chain could take by finding a block with a certain number of leading zeros. And the number of paths that we have reduced is what we'll call the change in entropy, and it is equal to 1 over 2 to the n. So if we find a block that in this example has 9 zeros, each one of those zeros is worth 4 bits because it's in hex. So that's 36. 36 bits of removed entropy. Our change in S, or delta S, would be 1 over 2 to the 36. And when we have a chain of blocks, we could then compute the total reduction in entropy by taking the prior block's entropy and multiplying it by the current block's entropy. So one of the things that was missed here pretty severely in the concept of work is that although mining a single hash is an independent event, or what we would call a Poisson process, once I create a reference back to a previous block, a parent hash link, which all blockchains have, I've now taken what were two sequences of independent events, but I've made them dependent by having the subsequent block reference the prior block. And when I make that dependent, I'm no longer adding, I am multiplying to find likelihood or define reduction in entropy. So practically speaking, what happens here? That same example where I found those 5 extra zeros, which previously were worth 1,000,000 extra difficulty in current proof of work, if I use a entropy calculation, the amount of similar delta S here I have is only 36 bits. And what does that mean in terms of the time an attacker could withhold a block for? It means that an attacker could only withhold that alternate block in this particular example for 2 additional blocks. So what we've done by measuring the thing that we're doing properly, i.e. reducing entropy, we actually come up with a weighting mechanism which much more closely represents the reality of the stochastic process that's taking place during mining. And if we do that, we can use intrinsics, we can still maintain our finite finalization time, because what we've done here is we've taken our intrinsic calculation, which is geometric, and we've paired it with effectively a new weight calculation, entropy, which is also geometric, And those two geometric terms effectively cancel out. So even though the intrinsic is now geometric, it's paired with an entropy calculation that is also geometric, which means we can maintain a finite finalization guarantee when we use both. So computing entropy with intrinsic weight removes contention while maintaining a finite finalization guarantee. Okay, any questions on that overview of contention, Brenny?
That's making more sense to me now. And let me look at the questions and see if there's anything. Doesn't seem like there are any specific questions yet. So, Jude, answering some questions about mining, how people can get into mining Quai, but I don't think there's any questions for you right now.
Okay, great. We'll keep going. So I've kind of given an overview of contention, and I've led you through sort of the thought process of how to eliminate contention, which when you couple these things together creates PoEM, our proof of entropy minima. So proof of entropy minima, what is it? We use intrinsic entropy to weigh and choose a head. So instead of using work, which is a physically meaningless arbitrary value, which is operating in a linear field and coercing out information from our system by setting block weight to threshold difficulty, we can maintain all information about our system. We can couple two geometric fields, and we can maintain finite finalization guarantees while eliminating all contention from the system. So there's three different schools, but two that I've summarized here to think about this. One way you can think about this is mathematically. So if you think about this as just strict combinatorics, and we're talking about what is the likelihood of a block being found, and what is the likelihood of multiple blocks being found in a chain. So we could use a mathematical interpretation of this. So linked events are dependent, and what we're doing is we're choosing the least likely head to exist. We can also think about it from a physics standpoint. So if you think about it from a systems standpoint or a physics standpoint, what we're doing is we're reducing entropy within the system at the expense of expending work or creating entropy outside the system. And what that manifests as within the real world is miners consuming electricity to find blocks. But that reduction of entropy is expensive. And if we measure the entropy reduction accurately, we can always figure out in any scenario what the most expensive thing was to create. And if we're talking about trying to finalize something, that is indeed exactly our goal. And what we then do is we choose the most expensive head, i.e. the one that has reduced the most entropy. So although this seems very complex, PoEM actually boils down just to that equation. And if you understand what that equation is trying to say, namely that delta S, entropy, is equal to 1 over 2 to the n, where n is the number of bits that are reduced when you find a block, you can understand PoEM, and everything in this presentation, every consequence of design, is described by that singular equation. Now the cool part here is entropy is time invariant mechanism to choose heads and coordinate chains. And this is a really important concept because in a distributed system, we don't have time. We only have sequence. Now the problem is, if you think about those Bitcoin examples, we have tens of thousands of nodes around the world, and every node could potentially be producing a block. Now, once that block starts propagating, we don't actually know when that block was found because the nodes don't have any sort of shared synchrony. All they know is when they receive the block, which one they got first. So some amount of network topology overlay and just sort of luck of where a block is produced versus how it propagates through the network will dictate the order in which blocks arrive. And then our preference is influenced by that random time that is imputed upon that block by the propagation through the network. But the really cool part about this is that equation has no time value. There is no t in this equation. So what that means is that if we measure a blockchain using entropy, it becomes time invariant. So if you give me a block and you give it to me right now, or you give it to me a second from now, or you give it to me 10 seconds from now, or you give it to me a year from now, that block has exactly the same meaning to me. Sequence does not matter in which it arrives. Time does not matter in which it arrives. The only thing that matters is its intrinsic entropy and its order in its sequence.
One quick question here, Dr. K. Why do you think it is that time has always been, I guess, traditionally a given in these systems as like a factor? Meaning, why has no one thought about things in, terms of, as we're doing things with PoEM? Do you know what I mean?
Well, so there's like the direct answer and there's the meta answer. So maybe I'll start with the direct answer. The direct answer is when we start talking about averages, we start talking about time. If we start talking about hash rate, we've just introduced time. And so because anytime we start talking about statistical processes and we start talking about average distributions or likelihoods given a hash rate, right? Hashes per second, all of those things just intrinsically have time associated with them. So when we start to think about things, we immediately start pulling time into the equation. But time does not need to be there. It just confuses our understanding of what's going on, and it causes all of the inefficiencies that exist with proof-of-work blockchains. It causes the Sybil resistance to go below 51%. It causes us not to be able to use intrinsic difficulties. It causes block withholding attacks. So if you think about what you're doing when you have an intrinsic block difficulty and you're cutting zeros off, you're taking information out of your sample. Because the fundamental thing that we're trying to do with a work-based progression is we're trying to understand who is putting the most work into making the chain and what chain tip has the most work. So if I start cutting out zeros, which are an accurate sample of the amount of effort that's gone into producing that block, I'm cutting out information from the world that's being given to me. So my choice and my representation is going to become less accurate. The reason that they chose to do that is because they didn't understand the mathematics and they started linearly progressing the measurement of total difficulty forward. And so the coercion of an intrinsic difficulty down to the threshold difficulty is what I like to call Satoshi's friendly finalization mechanism. And it's just as funny as any modern finalization mechanism proposal in terms of arbitrary block depth or time.
Got it. Well, that's helpful. Thank you.
Now, there's a meta answer to this as well. And the meta answer is time does not exist. So as humans, we use time as a mechanism to try to more easily understand the observed physical world. But if I zoom into space-time, so to speak, if I zoom into the fabric of reality, there isn't a clock. Right? Time is a derivative abstraction of our understanding of a linear progression of a sequence of events. But it is always a derivative, and it always obscures the underlying understanding. Now, we can use it somewhat effectively in some cases to make approximations, but in all cases, we're causing a downsampling of reality. So this is a great example of that, and that once we dispose of time, the answer to this question becomes almost obvious.
I'm gonna have to think on that.
So I mean, if you want to even get more meta, the person that would really like this is actually Stephen Wolfram, because his sort of modern effort at rewriting physics using causal invariance seems to be convergent on what we're doing here with blockchains. So a blockchain in and of itself has no time. A blockchain is just an ordered sequence of events that's supposed to be immutable or is supposed to be invariant. In a blockchain, there is no concept of time, right? It's just a concept of what came before what. And in Stephen Wolfram's description of reality, he treats it in the exact same way. So, interesting stuff. So,
it certainly is.
The next thing to consider here is PoEM with subshares. So the difference between proof of work or POW and PoEM becomes greater when we start to consider DOM and subchains. So with proof of work, if we look at having a DOM chain, so on the right here we have a region chain, so to speak, and we have a zone chain progressing below this region chain. Our finalization is on the order, we'll call K, meaning the number of blocks, is on the order of 2 to the MD, where MD is the additional difficulty that's required to find a region block compared to a zone block. So if, that should be MT, by the way, sorry. So an example of this would be if MD or MT were 20, the finalization number would be about 1 million, meaning you could maintain a withholding attack with a region block that has 20 extra bits of difficulty for effectively 1 million zone blocks. And for the average one, so not like a lucky one, our average DOM can withhold that block for the average time of a DOM block. So in a region, if we say a region block's every 4 minutes, and I find a region block sort of immediately after a region block, like in this example, I could just sit here and withhold that block for 4 minutes, and then I could orphan off that zone chain in its entirety. That's been generated for the next 4 minutes. Now, we can try to fix this by creating a time-based withholding detection mechanism, but that time-based withholding detection mechanism would have to be ancillary to our work-based mechanism of choosing a tip to mine and produce blocks on. And once we start creating two reward functions on a single process, it can become very difficult, but more importantly, it becomes arbitrary in terms of how you pick the balance between those two reward functions. The cool part about PoEM is that with using PoEM, that DOM share's finalization is on the order of MT plus MD over MD. And for whatever MT value we may choose, that means that for reasonable values of MD and say a bit field of 256 bits, we've fully limited our K value to be bounded between 2 and 10, meaning you will only be able to withhold that region block for up to 2 subshares or 2 zone blocks or up to 10 zone blocks. So the difference there being in the first example, that would have been 4 minutes. And the second example, normally it's going to be 20 seconds. So instead of thinking about that as the time which that DOM block can be withheld, you should now actually start thinking about it as that's the time in which the DOM must propagate. So the pick of the MT value relative to the MD value is actually determining our propagation time of our dominant blocks in our network before they will get uncled by the production of subchain blocks. So the really cool part here is PoEM solves the withholding problem because it fairly weights the blocks, but we do it without creating two reward functions. We only create a single reward function, which is minimize entropy. So I don't have to come up with some arbitrary measurement of staleness of a DOM block to figure out if it can be referenced or not. I just measure the entropy, and the entropy will take care of the fact if that block was withheld or not, and for how long, and if it should be built on. So I can have a single reward function that does everything that I need to do. The other interesting thing that comes out of this is there's actually now something of an optimal hash function. So it's somewhat intuitive to think that if the goal of the system is to minimize entropy, that the hash function should minimize entropy most efficiently to finalize most quickly. And that's what that previous equation rewritten here is telling us. That MD value is the threshold value for our lowest share, or zone block in this case. So the larger that value I can make MD, the more quickly I will finalize, because the smaller I'm making this this total fraction. So now if we look at the difference between hash functions, say SHA-256, script, fhash, etc., how they manifest in terms of the number of zeros they produce per kilowatt input would actually mean that there's a preference to one over the other, because for a given amount of kilowatts, one will finalize significantly faster than another. So for 1 kilowatt of energy, for example, if fhash created 1 zero but SHA created 3, SHA is going to finalize 3 times faster than fhash. So now with any proposal of any hash function, we can now objectively measure how good it is as a finalization mechanism using this equation. So what does that mean for PoEM? It means we desire the most efficient entropy reducing function while maintaining collision resistance and the one-way property of a hash function. So to do that, there's a couple factors that we can think about. One is L, which is our field size. So this is just typically assumed to be 256-bit in most blockchain systems, but there's a good argument that you could reduce L to 128 bits, which in having the size would actually quadratically reduce the amount of time and number of operations it would take to compute any single hash. So by having your field size, you could immediately increase the efficiency of your hash function by a factor of 4. And that would help you create the largest lower bit threshold in your subshares as possible, which would then minimize the finalization K. So we want to maximize MD, minimize L, so that we can minimize our finalization K. Which means PoEM provides the first objective mechanism for choosing a hash function, which is hilarious to me, because in sort of one of the first arguments with blockchains became the hash function arguments. And if things should be, ASIC friendly or ASIC resistant or CPU friendly or GPU friendly, and can we memory bound them so that they can only be run on GPUs and they'll be inefficient to make on ASICs, so on and so forth. And this was one of the largest arguments in crypto for many, many years. So the fact that PoEM provides an objective measure mechanism for choosing that hash function, is super powerful. And so what happens when we need to now extend and make multi-chain PoEM? And that's really getting into Quai Network. So when we look at one chain, we have an issue that's relatively simple to look at. And you're thinking, why is it a big deal that, I have to wait this amount of time before I resolve contention? Contention becomes exponentially worse with multiple chains. If I have 2 chains running and both of these chains are in contention for a whole block, and somehow I'm also coordinating those with a dominant share, I'm going to very quickly create a system which I can't coordinate. at all because of the delay in resolution of contention. So what happens in multi-chain PoEM is that we use coincident blocks to create a multi-context commitment. When we find a multi-context commitment, our entropy becomes the entropy of the DOM is the entropy of the previous DOM block plus the change in entropy that's been accumulated in the subordinate context, which is referencing that dominant since the last time it referenced. What that means is that DOM blocks only inherit the delta S of the subs, and DOM blocks are determined by the total delta S. This allows us to have a fair comparison between the subordinate, dominant, and coordinate block comparisons. And it also creates DOMs on a consistent interval. So instead of having random intervals, so if we look at like a Bitcoin block, and Bitcoin blocks will sometimes be generated in 10 seconds, sometimes will be generated in an hour, and on average, it'll take 10 minutes to find a Bitcoin block. But they'll have a normal distribution around 10 minutes with very long tails. When we look at this system, because our DOM blocks are now determined by a total accumulated delta S of our subs, the interval on which the dominant blocks are found can now become consistent. So in Prime, we would actually expect if we say that these are going to be 10-minute blocks, we would expect these to actually be 10-minute blocks, maybe plus or minus 20 seconds all the time. So now our liveliness relative to actual time becomes incredibly consistent across the hierarchy. Cool. So PoEM, in summary, I would say PoEM is the way to create hash-based blockchains. It creates time-invariant sequence of events, i.e. transactions, and given a set of data, all chains will always make the same choice. It doesn't matter when or in what order blocks arrive, and comparison of design choices is trivial because time is not involved. So if we have a question about how we should design the system now, we can just go back to this nice time-invariant equation, and we can easily derive what the right choice is given two options. Any divergence that naturally exists due to latencies in the network is instantaneously resolved. We have no wasted time, and we have no wasted hash to determine the best head choice. This also allows fair comparisons of any blocks or sequence of blocks in any context. So when I'm looking at two zone blocks and two zone chains, it's very easy to say, oh, well, I have two zone blocks here or three zone blocks there. But how many zone blocks is a DOM block worth? How many zone blocks is an immediate DOM block worth? And what PoEM does is it allows us to equally compare all different sequences and all different numbers of blocks against any context and do it in a perfectly fair and accurate way. So PoEM can ultimately coordinate an arbitrarily large number of chains. And we're only limited by the data propagation time and our global transaction times. And the entropy minima in PoEM is more of a discovery inherent to physics than it is an invention. So what we think we've actually found here is like a fundamental property more than it really is a design choice. And the interesting thing is with that one equation, if you just follow it, it will tell you the best way to design a hash-based chain, full stop. Like all the way through to implementation details. So it's pretty powerful. So with that, I'll take questions.
Wow. Okay. There's a lot here. There's a lot here, but at the same time, it seems like most people were just absorbing. There was people showing you a lot of love in the chat, but not many questions. So
yeah.
One question I have for you, like whenever you're explaining PoEM to somebody for the first time, what's the thing that's usually most confusing for them that you usually have to clear up?
Well, I mean, to be fair, I haven't actually described this very many times. For people who are intimately familiar with the trade-offs of proof-of-work blockchains, there is a slight amount of counterintuition that exists because people are so obsessed with time-based systems. And once you create a time invariant system, it can clash with the intuition that one might bring using a time basis. I would say would be the biggest thing for people that kind of get this. So you'll be thinking, oh, but this block has to be worth this much because it's on average this hard to find. But the problem is, if we look at like a DOM block, it's only as good as the number of, or the amount of work that's referenced in its sequence. So if I'm truly just lucky and I immediately find a region block, the fact that I found that region block without finding any subshares is telling everybody that I just got lucky. Because if I was actually putting that much work into the system for that period of time, I would have found a bunch of zone blocks before I found the region block. So waiting that region block that has 30 zone blocks prior to it that it's referencing, the same as a region block that's quote unquote lucky that has no zone blocks that it references, is ridiculous. But it's counterintuitive to the time-based concept.
Would you want to expand a little bit on, you mentioned Stephen Wolfram, would you want to expand the relation between PoEM and Wolfram's ideas on time invariance?
Yeah, I can do it a little bit. I don't want to go too far because I don't want to like do his work injustice.
Sure.
But basically his concept is that reality is just a sequence of events, and it's a progressing sequence of events in order, and time doesn't really exist. So when we think about space-time, we've already made a mistake because we're calling it space-time. The better idea of it is to think about it as sequence over space rather than as space and time. And then what ends up happening is that 99% of the time, if you think about it in Wolfram's frame of view, you'll agree with special relativity. But 1% of the time, you're going to start creating disagreements. And the disagreements really arise at the places where probably physics is the most counterintuitive, which is probably the right places for them to arise. So, for example, Wolfram talks about causal invariance, which would eliminate the possibility of spooky action at a distance with quantum entanglement as a means to communicate information faster than light. So, from an intuition standpoint, Wolfram's ideas make a lot more sense to me, but it also kind of matches, this system. So you have like a random event, a block is created or a transaction is produced, and then it starts to propagate, and it's propagating through space, on the wires. And then the question is, how does that eventually order in the system and affect the ordering of the other events that were randomly propagating from the other places? And that's basically his description of the world. And so this is like a mini description of what Stephen Wolfram is trying to do with redefining physics. So it's just interesting, the similitude between them.
Got it. That's interesting. Green Armor had a question here. He said that he has a discussion running on Reddit in connection to your video about mining with GPUs. But we also mentioned that Quai will likely develop an ASIC for mining, and he's asking if what the relation is to PoEM there and mining with ASICs.
Yeah, well, I mean, basically PoEM is saying that you ultimately have to have an ASIC, because an ASIC will ultimately turn electrons into entropy reducing hashes most efficiently. I think in any choice of hash function that we've been considering, we've always been considering something that would be relatively efficient. PoEM may change the exact choice of hash function at the end. So like right now we have Blake 3 implemented, but if you look at PoEM, it may make more sense to do something like 128-bit Blake 2s. So there may be an influence on that, but that's still kind of up in the air.
Got it. Cool. Well, I think that's all the questions that we have right now. So.
Okay, awesome, guys.
And then one other question from Kishore, he just added, can we say delta S is the E equals MC squared moment of blockchain?
I potentially think it might be, but only time will tell, obviously.
And then Green Armor chimed in again. I'm not sure I understand here. You may have to clarify. He said, is it possible with PoEM to be ASIC resistant?
I can kind of chime in here. I talked to Green Armor the other day. I think his more question was that sometimes people have concerns over whether ASIC mining can truly be decentralized. It's just like cost of entry can be high. So I think his question was more, we do PoEM without having to introduce ASICs.
So the cool part about Quai and the fact that we run subshares and the fact that we run slices and there's a forthcoming additional subshare mechanism, effectively the network in and of itself is already a distributed mining pool. So the amount of decentralization that's being forced into the system due to miners needing to topologically optimize for mining in a given context, in addition to the de minimis amount of rewardable share that can go into mining, I think we already have strong mechanisms for causing decentralization in the mining process. That being said, obviously having ASICs and having custom silicon, obviously does create some barrier to entry. However, again, if you look at trying to accelerate finalization for the least amount of energy possible, that equation that we put up basically makes it a foregone conclusion that you must use an ASIC.
Cool. Got it.
Long term, of course.
Well,
like short term, everybody's going to start with GPUs and they're going to be perfectly competitive. But long term, silicon will get spun.
Well, I think that's all the questions that we have now. So I don't know if we have any closing remarks. We're coming up to the top of the hour.
No, cool. I just appreciate people for coming again. Enjoy, sharing with everybody. So super excited about PoEM. I think it is the answer to the problem, and we'll see where it goes. Oh, we already have the proof of concept running in the code base right now, and it will be live for testnet.